Yeah, are you good now?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Testing, okay.
Івана Феденчук. Я представляю моніторинг-аналітичну групу «Цифру».
Мікрофон.
Доброго дня. Мене звати Івана Феденчук. Я представляю моніторинго-аналітичну групу «Цифра», яка є організатором цього заходу. Я дуже рада бачити вас сьогодні в цій аудиторії. Це вже третій захід професора Такера у Києві, і мене дуже тішить те, що частину з вас я бачила на двох попередніх заходах. Сьогодні професор нам розкаже про те, як засновували, як працює, як функціонує Monkey Cage блог на Washington Post. So, Professor Tucker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And are we good on the? Everyone's good on volume? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. I especially want to thank some people in the audience who've appeared at multiple talks of mine during my visit to Kiev. I am incredibly flattered, and it's a pleasure to get to talk to you. And it's a pleasure to get to talk about different topics. So today I'm going to talk about essentially two things. Today this talk is called Writing About Research for the Broader Public, Blogging at the Monkey Cage. So just a quick introduction to sort of why I'm here and why I'm giving this talk. So as was said, I'm a professor of politics at NYU. I'm also the co-director of the NYU Social Media and Political Participation, or SMAP Lab, which is a lab that's studying the intersection of new media and politics. So that's given me a kind of insight and view into new media besides being a practitioner of it, where I've been blogging at this blog, which I'll talk about more throughout the talk, called The Monkey Cage, since 2008, which crazily is like approaching 10 years now at this point in time. I also recently served on an American Political Science Association special task force on thinking about public engagement among academics. So I'm going to talk to you today from the vantage point of being a true believer. Like, I'm going to talk to you about public engagement today, but this is something that I believe in, and this is something that I think is really important. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm going to start by talking about why scholars, and those of you who are in this room who are conducting academic scholarship and academic research, either inside the academy, outside the academy, why scholars should think about writing for the broader public. And it's possible that from your perspective here in Ukraine, this seems fairly obvious, but until very recently, this was not obvious at all in academia in America. And in fact, scholars were often penalized for trying to write for the broader public as a kind of distraction from their academic mission. So that's the first thing I want to do, is talk about why I think scholars should write for the broader public. Then I'm going to talk about how individuals and the discipline as a whole, and disciplinary organizations, can facilitate this, how they can encourage public engagement, how as an individual you can take steps to be able to engage the public, but also how disciplinary associations can help with this. And then finally, I'm going to do this thing which Nazar had asked me to do, which I've never really done before, but I'm going to tell the story to sort of illustrate this. I'm going to tell the story of the history of our blog, The Monkey Cage, which is now at the Washington Post, and sort of where that came from and how that came to be. So that's the idea. So first, hopefully I'm going to sort of hook you on why this is important, give you some advice about doing it if you're interested in it, and then tell you about my own experiences. All right, so why should scholars engage with the broader public? So I'll give you a second to read this. So anyone who can't read English, it says, what are you studying, young man? It's political science. And then the king says, what exactly is political science? And he says, it's like science fiction, only it's less relevant. All right, so why should we engage with the broader public, even if there's skepticism about what we do? Scholars possess expertise. When we try to study a topic, we go about it in a different way than a journalist who has to write for a pressing deadline. We go about it differently than an embassy staffer who has to get advice to someone by some particular point in time about how to respond to an event. Lots of different people are concerned about politics and public policy, but scholars have the luxury, compared to a lot of other people in a lot of other jobs, to take time to do serious investigation, to try to test hypotheses about the way the world works, and crucially, to bring empirical evidence to assumptions that they may have had previously to see if those assumptions hold up to empirical evidence. Which is to say that most scholars, when they approach their research, are employing a particular method, which we call the scientific method, which has to do with having theory, then having hypotheses that are observable implications of those theories, then having data to test whether those hypotheses hold. This is a time-consuming process. It involves training. It involves a lot of hard work. And each individual scholar, often because of this, invests in one small particular piece of knowledge that they get to know a lot about. Collectively, however, we as scholars know a ton about a lot of things out there, right? And this expertise that we've developed, we are fortunate enough to be living in a world where we get paid to develop this kind of expertise, where we don't necessarily have to respond to deadlines, unless you edit the Monkey Cage blog, in which case you have lots of deadlines. But if you're in normal scholarship, right, you don't have to respond. So you can spend 3 years trying to figure out what is the effect of domestic election observers on election results, right? And most of the time, most people in the mass public are not going to be particularly interested in that. But at times, when there's concerns about fraudulent election in a particular country, people are going to be very interested in that. And collectively, we as scholars have a ton of information about the way the world works. And it's my belief that that information can add important value to public debates over politics, how politics should be organized. The person who came on this sort of speaking tour before me, Eric Heron, who's worked on electoral systems, governments around the world are constantly debating whether to reform electoral systems. There are scholars who have studied the effects of electoral systems on exactly the things that reformers are trying to change in this regard. So I think you have this ability to add value to public debates, and I think that it's, in some sense, if I was to go so strong as to say, like, as scholars, we get to have these incredible careers where we get to spend all this time really being careful about our research, really trying hard to figure out all the ways we could possibly be wrong. It's a luxury that a lot of people in more fast-paced jobs don't always have. And so there's a kind of an obligation, if society has chosen to allocate its resources in a way that lets us do this, to try to give something back to society where we can do this. All right, so what can you do if you buy my explanation that it's a good idea for scholars to try to engage more broadly, to share what they've learned with the knowledge from the wider public? And what as well can the discipline and professional organizations do? And I don't know the current status of this, where all you guys are studying and what the, so I'm more talking about things that I've seen in the United States evolving. But in terms of what can individuals do, the most important thing that you can do, in this case, can I move this out of the way? No. All right. The most important thing that individuals can do is to learn to write in a way that's accessible to the public. And I know there's a number of graduate students here who are sort of earlier on in careers and stuff like that. One of the weirdest things about academia is that we are encouraged at times to write in a way that's not accessible. So why are we encouraged to write in a way that's not accessible? The way we get promoted, the way we get jobs, is through the approval of our peers. When you're a graduate student trying to get your first job, you apply to search committees who will read your research, read your work. And there is a tremendous temptation to want to show how in the know you are, how clever you are, how much you've learned the latest cutting-edge statistical methods, how much you understand the latest discoveries about causal inference and the arguments people are making. And the way that you show that you belong to be in this club is by using lots of words that only people in that club understand, right? And so we have this situation, and I remember this. I was in graduate school, and I was told by a person who I tremendously respect, who actually went on and had a career that's very different from this, but like, the audience for your work is not your grandparents, not your friends. The audience for your work is other academics. And that's true. That's absolutely true in terms of promotion, right? When you get promoted, when you have to get letters written, they're going to be written by other academics who are going to read your academic research. But the same set of skills that you develop to sort of show how well you've learned everything, how much you understand all these difficult concepts, can make your writing completely and utterly inaccessible to the public. So the first thing you have to do is really begin to remember that you're not writing for other academics. And the amazing thing about this, and this could go back in the slide of like why you should do this, and we can talk more about these larger things, but the amazing thing about this is that you'll actually find when you force yourself to write in a way that's clear to someone who's not an academic, you get a better idea about the flaws in your logic, the flaws in your reasoning. If you can't explain what you're doing in your research to your smart friend who's a chemist, or to your smart friend who is working in the US Embassy, who knows stuff about politics, but you can't explain it without using the word heteroskedasticity or a causal inference, then you don't have a clear enough grasp yet on what you're trying to do. And one of the amazing things about all this time I've spent blogging is that I've always felt like it's made my writing in the presentation of my own research, it's over the years I feel like I've gotten to be a much better writer because I stopped trying to write just for academics and I started trying to write for a wider public, and I've been able to bring the insights of that back into my writing in academic journals as well. So that's the first thing. You want to learn to write in a way that's accessible, because you can be the smartest person in the world doing the most interesting research. If you can't explain it in a way that other people can understand, people are not going to be interested in publishing it, and even if you self-publish it, people aren't going to read it, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, this is a little larger thing, you can, the second thing is, if you want to, you can, I'm going to pass on this one for a second. I mean, if you want to, this is more about public engagement largely spent. I mean, one thing to just sort of realize is that people often say like, I'm doing this interesting research, but I don't have a chance to present it. There's a bit of self-presentation that goes on here, and this is one of these problems where gender bias tends to rear its head in academia. Men are more likely to be more likely to be aggressive about sort of promoting themselves than women tend to be. So this is especially important advice for women. But like, one thing to realize is that research centers are often looking for people to speak about their work. And so you don't necessarily always have to wait and hang back and hope that someone's going to invite you to present your work. If you see a research center that's doing the type of work you're doing and you're at a conference with someone who's at that center, you can introduce yourself. You can let them know. Join conversations on social media. Now, you will get differing sets of opinions about this, but when you have research that's relevant to discussions that are going on social media, this can be a time where you can have somewhere where you are in a position of expertise and where you can talk about your research. If that's not comfortable, when you publish an article, you can put something out on social media, again, using language that's accessible, telling people that you've published this article. Lots of people love to say congratulations about publishing an article. You do it on Facebook, you'll get lots of likes, but you've also let people know what you're doing. And again, you're talking about your research in a way that's accessible. You should be open to talking to reporters if reporters are interested in your research. This is an important part of public engagement, right? And it's a part that a lot of academics don't like. It can feel like it's a waste of time. It can feel like the first time you get misquoted, it can be really unpleasant. But on the other hand, there is, whether you choose to engage with it or not, there is public debate going on these issues. And if you're writing on issues about which there's public debate, chances are you may know more about one particular part of that issue than just about anybody. I mean, that's the nature of when you're writing a dissertation. That's the nature when you're writing a book. So this is another way that you can, when your work has broader relevance, don't be afraid to share it if people are interested in it. In general, I think it's valuable for you as an individual scholar, but also for all of us collectively as a discipline, to show that our work has relevance, right? We live in an era now, this is particularly the case in the United States, right, where there's this increasing encroachment of the consumer model when thinking about education. This customers, you want to see a bunch of academics get upset, ask them about customer services approaches to universities, and people will, and you can just duck and get out of the way and watch the conversation fly. But there is a sense, right, especially if you are at a state-funded institution, if you look at the REF in England, the way that funding is being allocated to universities in England, there is a growing sense, much more so than when the generation before us was going through graduate school and becoming faculty, that contributing to knowledge for the sake of knowledge is not enough anymore. Now, we can argue that and debate that, but the trick is if you can do the basic scientific research that you want to do, but also talk about the broader relevance of what you're learning for things that people care about, That's good for us as a discipline. Now, I've given this talk in the United States a lot. In the United States, Congress is perpetually trying to cut the tiny amount of the budget that funds political science research in the United States. I once learned that I think funding for political science research is the same in Denmark as it is in the United States, right? And Denmark has like 5 million people in it, and we have 300 million. But Congress still is constantly trying to cut it. And so I try to make the argument to my colleagues, like, you want to be out there showing that the research is valuable. You want, nobody wants to cut research for funding cancer, for fighting cancer, not funding cancer, for fighting cancer. Nobody wants to cut research to fight cancer, right? Even in the most recent budget, right? Trump tried to cut money for the NIH, and the Republicans in Congress put more money in for the NIH, right? Like, this is not a popular thing. It's very easy to say, oh, we need to fund science. But occasionally people say, we're going to cut all the political science funding and we're going to give it to cancer research, right? They already have $6 billion for cancer research. We're going to take our $10 million and throw it in there too, right? So, but that's a compelling argument. We study politics. Like, we know what resonates. It's really hard to say that to the public. Like, we should be we should be funding these political. So I think it's important when we can get out there, do things like I'm doing right now, and talk about sort of the value of what you're learning, and talk about it in public about what you add to the public debate. So those are some big picture things. In terms of writing about your work, learn to write in a style that can be read by non-academics. That was the point I made previously. Oh yeah, avoid assuming background knowledge. Okay, this is, when we get into the monkey cage, I'm writing for the monkey cage in a second, like the number one thing we ever have to go back to people is to say, I'm going to write a piece about the French election, and they just jump in and talk about Macron. You got to introduce who Macron is if you want to do this. Like, and the way you can do this, it doesn't mean you have to change everything you're doing, but 3-word phrases that intuitively explain things. Like, before you see the PS in France, you say the left-wing party in France. Then people know that and they're up to speed on this. But the lack of background knowledge that you as a scholar will have spent so much of your life focusing in on this topic. You will know more about that topic than just about anybody in the world. But you'll be surrounded by people who know a bunch of things about that topic. But you forget that when you go out a little bit more, there's lots of people who are really interested in politics who don't know anything about that topic, right? And so as the ultimate guide of don't overestimate what your audience knows, this was one of the most popular posts ever on the monkey cage. There was a survey where a couple American researchers asked Americans to place Ukraine on a map. Apropos enough, we're in Ukraine. I would assume everyone in this audience knows where Ukraine is. This is what happened, right? So don't assume that people know where Ukraine is, unfortunately, right? Like, you can, so when you are writing, as a general rule of thumb, when you're writing, these are some of our favorite ones, like that Ukraine is in Iceland, actually, and Australia is the other big ones. So maybe like Western Canada is understandable, but the rest of it is anyway. So you want to learn to write in a style that can be read by non-academics. Here's the second big thing: when you're pitching your writing, if you want to write about your research and you're pitching this to people at news magazines, at foreign affairs, at foreign policy, at all these places. What you want to be able to talk about is to think about the application of your research to topical issues. Right? Now, for some people, that's going to be really difficult. You may be doing sort of abstract formal modeling or machine learning techniques and stuff like that. But for most of us, we can think about what our research is doing and how it might have an application to something that's going on contemporarily. This makes for a much better pitch if you're going to sort of try to get someone to publish what you're writing, if you have a hook into something that's going on right now, right? So French elections, you study the effect of electoral systems. You've done a lot of research on 1-round systems versus 2-round systems. You can start with a 3-line hook about what's going on with the French elections, and then you go into the research that you've done. So that's the second big thing. And this is particularly, when I come back to the monkey cage, this is a particularly big thing for us now these days. Dan Dresner, who's been blogging longer than I have and has his own blog at the Washington Post, one of sort of the first political science bloggers, had this very nice, I was on something, or saw something he had done, this very nice thing where he said, one of the simplest ways if you're trying to reach out and get published is to talk about things that's known to people in the academy, that's common knowledge among political scientists, but not known in the wider mass public. So I think that's an interesting piece of advice. The other thing I was saying, yeah, so exactly, we may have, there may be, so we may know, like the democratic peace may be a widely known thing within academic circles in IR, that democracies don't tend to fight with each other. But you're reading about things in the mass public, is this country going to go to war, this country going to go to war? Like, that may be an insight that comes out of your research per se, but it's something that you can add. One big thing is that we tend to often think about, in political science, we tend to think about in terms of game theoretic or strategic interaction terms. So a lot of not just like what's the best move for you to make, but conditional on what I think, what's the best move for you to make. And those kinds of insights, I think, can be made in a way that that it might be commonplace, that it wouldn't be shocking to a bunch of political scientists to say that you want to take account of this, but you might look at some strategic interaction that's going on in the world and say, this would be useful. Electoral rules, right? Like we, in the academy, it's incredibly well known that proportional representation systems are more likely to produce multi-party systems than single-member districts. But the average person who's just doing business in Poland and may not, want to understand why Poland has so many political parties, and is that some sort of sign of dysfunction, or is it writing a piece about the fact that there's this sort of, again, this well-known fact that can be useful in the particular context. So that was his idea. That was one way if you're trying to get into this kind of public engagement type stuff. I mean, I once wrote in the early days of the Monkey Cage, we did more kind of fun stuff, and so I wrote a piece about, what game theory could tell us about LeBron James's contract negotiating status. So that was kind of a fun way to take a concept that was common in the academy and sort of play with it in a way that was sort of wider interest. It did not have any socially redeeming value. It was just kind of fun to write. Take initiative. This is the thing that I wanted to say, and this is less now that I think a lot of people in the academy know that the Monkey Cage takes submissions, but I was saying this at the beginning, there are a lot of resources, a lot of universities, the incentives that I was talking about here, why it's good for the discipline for us to show that our research is valuable, universities feel that way too. So there are resources at universities to help people do this. You don't have to start your own blog. You can try to see if you can do a guest post at an existing blog, right? So, there was a time when everyone seemed like they were starting their own blogs. Now it seems less like that, but there's a lot of, and I don't know, it differs, but it's got to be different by countries and different by regions. But in the United States, if you're writing about Congress, there is a blog that does a lot of stuff on Congress. If you're writing about parties, right? If you're writing about issues related to federalism, there are blogs. So you may want to sort of reach out. At the Monkey Cage, we now, 95% of our content is submissions. So it's people coming out. So you can take initiative. I think for a long time, there was a sense that if you wanted to do this sort of thing, you had to sit back and wait. You can start your own you can start your own blogs too. Again, there was a bit of an earlier period of time where more people were doing this. There's a little bit less of this, but some people are still doing stuff. Those of you who are interested in, some of you may know Scott Gelbach's work. He recently just started a blog. He's written a lot of stuff at the Monkey Cage for me in the past, but he wanted to be able to do shorter posts and do his own kind of things on that. It's great. I enjoy reading the stuff that he puts up there. But the interesting thing is now if you use WordPress to make your personal website, you can really begin to sort of blur the lines between having a blog and having a website. So you can set up your website in a way that you can also put up blog posts on it about your research about things. And that can, remember, everything's searchable these days. So that can help other people find what you're doing as well. And I think you can take outside the box opportunities, right? Peer review is not the only way you can share your research. So again, I'm here because the US Embassy invited me to come give some talks in Ukraine because they had a program that was valuable for. I'm out here sharing my research. Some of you saw me, now I'm talking about blogging, but I was at other things talking about my research. And that's not, that's not contributing, that's a different type of thing to do. But there are opportunities. You may get asked to work on a task force. You may get asked to, write something for a newsletter for a section of of an association, right? For a long time, I think the idea was that that peer-reviewed was the only thing that mattered and everything else was unimportant. And please do not, for all those of you who are junior here, come out of this thinking that peer review is not important. It is the key to promotion. It is the key to a lot of things. But it's not the only way to share what you're doing. And there are opportunities out there. There are other opportunities out there to do this. And I think you can find that when you do things that share your work in ways that doesn't necessarily involve peer review, you can also get interesting feedback on it. And again, if you were trying to think about, someone asks you to take your dissertation and write 2,000 words on it for a newsletter, right? That can crystallize your thinking about stuff. All right, I would also say use social media to share research. So these are ways you can get involved. The other big thing is to just be supportive of others. And this is probably not the right crowd for making this plea, but again, if you believe that scholars should be sharing their research with one another, one of the biggest impediments, with a broader audience, one of the biggest impediments to this was that for a long time, and still this is the case in the United States, scholars believed they would be punished for doing this, that this was frowned upon by the discipline. that this showed you weren't a serious scholar. So if that's what you think, you're entitled to that opinion. But if you share the opinion, your friend gets a blog post or they're mentioned, or they speak to a journalist in their interview, give them a pat on the back. When you get a little bit more senior, when you're being asked to write promotion letters for people, mention this stuff in a positive vein. I mean, that's what I think really makes the change happen. And I think this has changed in the 10 years that I've been doing this, somewhat significantly in American political science. And it may have been that in Europe there was always more of a sense of the scholar as a kind of public speaker in this regard. But those are my sort of things for individuals. For the discipline, I'll say this very briefly. We wrote a piece, we all wrote white papers for this task force that we were on public engagement. And they're very interesting to read. And this PS, which is this PS in Politics, which is this kind of disciplinary version of Journal it does more disciplinary stuff than research articles. But they nicely put all of these things together in a special online edition, which I think is open access. I think anyone can get access to this. And so they all appeared as this special issue on public engagement. So if you're interested in this topic, this is an interesting set of things to go read. This is the one that I worked on. Just very briefly, because some of you may be involved in associations in your own countries and going in that forward. But we really argued for a bottom-up approach, which was, actually this may have echoes of general questions of reform in Ukraine at this point in time. But we argued for a bottom-up approach of basically having the associations stay out of it in terms of not anointing an official blog of this association, that the Ukrainian Political Science Association, this will be our online media presence and it will be done in this way. But rather to sort of provide resources for people who want to do public engagement. So at conferences, have sessions like this, actually, and we've been going around and doing this kind of stuff for years at different conferences, where you have people who have experience with this kind of public engagement talking to scholars who are interested in it, or have logistical support that may help members of your association who want to do their own kind of engagement do things like that, and technical training on how to do some of this stuff. But avoiding sort of, our piece of advice, and you can read the arguments we made in here, but our piece of advice was to sort of avoid the official top-down model, and that this is a good way for associations to sort of move this forward. And then, again, this big thing, I think, to the extent that if you think public engagement is important, when you are thinking about these larger criterias of merit and promotion and hiring, to, as a discipline, not punish, at the very least, people who engage in public engagement. Ideally, you recognize it as a form of service. I would go even farther, because I know that my blogging has made my research better, because I have gotten feedback on stuff. I've been able to put ideas clearer, so you can see it as part of research. But I think that's farther along than we are right now. But to think of it as a kind of disciplinary service. Okay. Particular challenges for sort of area specialists. If you focus on a particular part of the world that's not the country in which you're living, where you're trying to do the public engagement, is even more so that, don't remember the map of Ukraine, don't assume readers know things. You know more than most of your readers, and it's not their fault. It's your obligation to suck them in, to tell them what they need to know so they can understand what your research is and what you're writing about. And so there is this sort of tension between the necessary background and hooking readers. And it's tempting to write for other area study specialists. Like if you're in Ukraine and you study American politics, it's tempting to just start writing, assuming all this background knowledge of American politics. But at the end of the day, then you're going to be writing for this very small audience. And if you write a little more generally, you'll write for a broader audience. The opportunities, though, is that because of the switch from newspapers and cable channels to all this digital content that's out there, there's just so much more of an opportunity than there was for scholars previously. I mean, when early on in my career, in the sort of early 2000s, I would try to write op-ed pieces. I'd send them to the New York Times. I'd wait 3 days, they'd get rejected. I'd send them to the Washington Post, I'd wait 3 days, they'd get rejected. That's kind of ironic now. But I'd wait 3 days, they'd get rejected. And then the event would have passed. And I wrote like 5 of these things, and I got 1 piece in the International Herald Tribune, right? Like, it was hard. It was really hard. Now there's like insatiable desire for online content. So it really does open up the possibilities, starting from that you can just start publishing your own things on medium.com or putting them up on your own website. But like, there's so many sites out there that are looking for content. And for those of you who are in Ukraine working on other countries, there may be opportunities in those countries. Or for those of you who are here specializing on Ukrainian politics, right? There are going to be places overseas that want content about Ukrainian politics at particular times and places, and you can be the expert on that. So it's an interesting time. It's challenging, but there are great opportunities. Okay, so the final part, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the monkey cage, and then I'll open it up to questions. So what is the monkey cage? So the monkey cage, this is physically what it looks like. It's embedded in the Washington Post right now. We always have some random ad up here and over there now that we're in that world. And then what you will see on this is the homepage of the monkey cage. It's at the Washington Post website, and then you'll see a list of the blog posts that have gone up, most recently on the homepage. All right, so here's the story behind it. It was started in 2007 as an independent blog. So it was a bunch of political scientists, which did not include me. It was led by John Sides and Lee Siegelman and Henry Farrell at George Washington University. And they put together a few people, and it was originally, I think, all people at GW. And they started this blog with the goal of sharing political science research with a larger audience. So all these things that I've sort of been preaching here today. Getting people to talk about their research in a way that would be accessible to a wider public. And at that point, it wasn't getting other people to do it. It was they were going to blog about political science research. It was primarily in the beginning focused on American politics and politics of the internet. So they were writing about American politics research, but also Henry Farrell has done all this incredible research on the internet, and so he was writing about internet politics at that point. So the methods behind this, sort of from the get-go, was to try to, and this was much more newer then. It was 10 years ago, this sort of stuff that I'm talking about. So this was a sort of radical idea. Write about political science research in a way that's accessible to a larger audience. Writing about politics from the perspective of a political scientist, so a little tongue-in-cheek, but like my LeBron James thing, like writing about, that wasn't actually politics, but writing about events like how a political scientist would think about this. How does game theory, how does strategic interactions lead us to think about things? How does the way we think about uncertainty, the way we think about testing hypotheses? And then from the get-go, what did political science have to say about sort of current political events and policy debates? And then this, I think, was one of the most important things in the long run for our success, which was, from the beginning, there was a decision to make this nonpartisan, and that this was not going to, that should say opinion, not opium, non-opinion and non-op-eds. And we have stuck with this through thick and thin, and I'll come back to this in a little bit. But the idea of the monkey cage was research-informed analysis. It was not to be another set of partisan anti-this group or anti-that group. We were going to talk about research and what had been learned from the research, and we were going to talk about how social scientists think about these kinds of questions. At the time, lots of people were starting individual blogs, but a lot of them were people on the left criticizing, at that point it was still the Bush administration, right? Or then people on the right writing responses to this. Being academia, it was more people on the left criticizing the right. But I think it was crucial from the point of view of the monkey cage is that it never went down that road. So from the get-go, and when I joined, that's the first thing you're told. It's nonpartisan. This is not a forum for criticizing either side. And also, this sort of grew out of that is that we did not write op-eds. So monkey cage pieces didn't end with saying, should happen. This is what should be done. They were, this is what research suggests. If this happens, this is likely to happen. And we've tried to stick with that thick and thin through the whole case. I'll come back to that in a minute. Then in 2009, after a year and a half, I joined the monkey cage. And this is significant only because I'm the one telling the story right now. But it's also significant in the sense that when they brought me on, it was with a view towards writing about this part of the world. And it was the first time they added someone who was sort of focusing more on politics outside of the United States than inside the United States. Eric Voitin joined shortly thereafter to sort of provide a voice on international relations. But so by this point, we then go from being a primarily American politics to trying to encompass comparative and international relations. I will say at that point in time, I was sort of like, I was brought in to sort of do the post-communist region, but like, since there was no one else doing the rest of the world, I was basically doing comparative, the entire rest of the world while these other guys were working on American, and then Eric came along for there. So that happened in 2009. In 2010, we were named by Forbes magazine one of the 7 most powerful blogs in the world. I think that was probably a bit of an overstatement, but it was a nice, it was a nice accolade. And if you do look at this sign, where they featured in this Forbes magazine thing was a article we had called a piece called "Restoring Sanity," and it was this sign at a protest. What do we want? Evidence-based change. When do we want it? After peer review. So anyway, that was so that happened in 2010. In 2011, we were awarded Blog of the Year by The Week magazine, becoming the first academic blog to ever be given this honor. It also taught me that you never want your face done by a cartoonist. That's me over there. So it also highlighted that at that point this sort of drove home a little bit. At that point, it was still all men who were doing this blog, so which is something that we worked hard to change in the future. The Monkey Cage, then in 2013, which is when this may have come on some of your radar screens, we joined the Washington Post. So we were invited in to join the Washington Post. And this is another kind of lesson learned from this thing. We had other opportunities to join other online publications, and we decided to stay independent for a while. Now, one of the consequences of staying independent was we made no money at all for the first, 6, 7 years we were doing this. We didn't have the wherewithal to host our own ads. We didn't want to host ads. We decided not to do that. We didn't jump at other opportunities. We waited until we found what we thought was a really good fit. And we were brought in, and it's actually been pretty amazing. The Post, while I don't feel like they promote us nearly as much as they could, and they, on the other hand, have been unbelievable in terms of editorial independence. And I've heard different things from different people who've had blogs moved to other publications, but we have complete editorial independence from them. And basically, the only thing they do is they copy edit at the end of our process. They need to look at each article quickly to make sure we haven't committed libel or anything that they could get sued for. But for the most part, it's still our blog, only now it's being published at the Washington Post. But there are other changes that have happened because of where we were. But that happened in 2013. And then most recently, we have now moved up after a number of years at the Post, whereas in the early years, we were doing the vast majority of the writing, and I was unbelievably grateful anytime I could find someone else who would be willing to do a guest post, because I was supposed to be posting 3 times a week, and it was great to get people. And also, I needed, I studied post-communist countries. The Arab Spring happened. I needed people who knew stuff about Egypt. Now we've actually moved to a situation where it's almost makes more sense to refer to us as editors as opposed to authors. If you look at the Monkey Cage now, the editors of the Monkey Cage, you don't even see us appearing all that much because we're spending almost all of our time dealing with submissions. And whereas it used to be that I would ecstatic, I would ask a friend, beg a friend, will you write a guest post for the Monkey Cage on this topic? I think you know something about this, we'd love to have your stuff. Now we get all these unsolicited submissions. I mean, I still do solicit from people on particular topics. Now, it's mainly people sending stuff in. And so in some ways, we're kind of a victim of our own success here because we have, I think, won in this sense that people now value having the Monkey Cage on their CV. It's not seen as a liability, but now people want to be in the Monkey Cage, which is amazing because we're doing this thing that we set out to do in the first place, which was draw on all this incredible knowledge that's out there. The downside is it's just less fun because we're not writing I'm not really writing anymore, I'm mainly editing, which is satisfying in other ways. So there's trade-offs with these kinds of things. Anyway, but today, we've just announced, we announced in February, we've just added three more co-editors now, so we're gonna be a staff of 10. We now have specialists in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, China, and we have a much larger US team at the moment. We're now gonna be actually gender equal. We'll have 5 women and 5 men, which is something we've been working really hard on the submission side. We've had 2 women, but we've added 3 more women now. And as I said, it's primarily submission-based. So it's turned into something different, but it's still something I think it's less fun than what the old thing used to be, but it's become this incredible resource for the discipline. And if I believe everything I said in the beginning, then this is a real public good for the discipline. Okay, so what have been some of the results? Okay, so the results are people are reading, which is kind of amazing. We started this off, we were a bunch of professors here. When I joined, we were getting, 1,000 views per day, which was a lot. That was already, 300,000 per year. By the time we moved to the Post, we were up to about 5,000 page views per day, which was getting us, 6-7 million page views. But last year, we got almost 40 million page views. So when you write for the Monkey Cage, people read your stuff. A low-end article, the low end of the distribution now would be a few thousand people read it. The modal piece is getting read, 7,000 to 10,000 times. But we have pieces that are read 500,000 times or 1 million times. So, which is incredible given that this started off as this idea John had that it would be good to have some political scientists blogging because it seemed like all the main bloggers were economists, right? So, people are reading. The other thing that's been really cool is that in the sense that we set out to make political science research accessible to people who are in policy fields and accessible to journalists, we have seen lots of things, and I have lots of other anecdotal stories that I can tell you, but we've seen lots of things about how these kinds of people who are in jobs where they are talking about politics, they're responding to politics, they're making decisions about policy, that they are indeed becoming aware of the stuff that we're doing, and ideally are using it to inform their decision-making process, or at the very least are able to now access this hard work that you have done as scholars when they're making their decisions. So like, this was an article that Ezra Klein did about how political science conquered Washington. This was a lot about what we had done with the monkey cage. This is a Supreme Court opinion citing the monkey cage. This is a statement by Senator Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the most popular senators in the United States, again, citing the monkey cage. So I can tell you all other sorts of stories and anecdotal, and believe me, when you write about things outside the United States, there are plenty of people who work on those parts of the world that are reading these things. The other thing, I think it's been really good for the people who've written for us. So what we found is that now that we have all these people who submissions, we've been surveying them, and we found that it's beneficial, that it leads to being in the monkey cage leads to exactly what we hoped it would, which is more interest in your work, and people get interest from all sorts of quarters from it. People have gotten, we get other opportunities. Fully half the people who wrote for us had other opportunities to do this kind of writing in the future, or were approached by people to go on the news, to come on NPR and talk about their research, to go on BBC, to all sorts of opportunities. So I think it's been very good for the people who've written for it, and I feel very proud about this because when we started, the story was that Dan Dresner hadn't gotten tenure at Chicago because he was doing too much blogging. And by the end of it, we now have this thing where we've got 1,500 people writing a guest post for us in a year, and they're getting all these opportunities and recognition out of it. Did other people pick up on? Did they have other opportunities where people picked up on their research? So it's a lot of. Originally, when we were independent, that was the main way we had an influence. Now, it's ironic, less other bloggers write about us because since we're already in the Washington Post, than when we were just independent, because then it was like they were discovering our stuff and spreading it out, but when it's already in the Post, it seems like that. And then the other thing that we've been able to do, which I think is kind of amazing, is really harness the power of academia to get academics talking in real time. This was stuff about these were all posts that we did related to Crimea, drawing on scholars who had been studying this part of the world for years and who really knew stuff. And I think in some ways the coverage of what happened in Crimea the monkey cage was one of the strongest places to get coverage. We had we had articles about what this meant for Kazakhstan. We had articles about the importance of religion. We had articles about relating things back to other frozen republics. We got all sorts of different things in here. And actually, this is even we had something on the Crimean Tatars as well. We drew on a host of scholars. And because now we have this symbiotic relationship where people know about our blog, scholars know that we are interested in research that's related to contemporary topics, they now approach us. When we approach them, they're very accessible. But I think it allows us to do a kind of in-depth coverage that harnesses all sorts of knowledge on all sorts of different topics, on Brexit, on Lord knows, on the US presidential elections, right? Like on all sorts of different things. We're able to draw on these scholars, where now scholars will come to us to put their research in there. We'll reach out to scholars, they're very amenable to it, and we're able to share all sorts of information. If you compare this to just about how everybody else covered Ukraine, the sort of depth of knowledge that was on this one blog in the back of the Washington Post, is pretty impressive. Okay, so lessons learned. I think the lessons I've learned from this is scholars are a fantastic resource for information. That with a little nudging, getting people to think about the implications of their work and how to write about it in a way that's accessible to others, we can provide more information to inform policy debates, to inform the way people talk about politics. I think we have had an effect on how elections are covered in the United States, for example, right now. I think the LSE blog that they do does amazingly good stuff about lots of things, European politics, British politics. There are a lot of places that are, I think that the tone of how we've talked about how politics is talked about has changed. And if you think about it, you know, there was long a tradition that if you were a science reporter, right, and you were studying something about a new medicine for a disease, right, you don't go and interview the person who has the disease, or maybe you do to ask them what it's like, but you would interview the scientist who was in charge of studying this. This was not the tradition with politics reporting. Politics reporting did not generally loop in political scientists for their studies. It talked to the political consultants, it talked to the candidates, it talked to voters. We have now, I think, interjected the science into this. And I think for those of us who work on, and I don't, you know, what different people work on, for those of us who work on politics not in our own country, you might often get quoted in a newspaper story, but it would be like a snippet. And half the time it wasn't what you meant to say, you know, it wasn't exactly, and it certainly wasn't nuanced. This gives scholars a chance, concisely, in 1,000 words, to talk about what they know, rather than being a snippet in a reporter's story or waiting 3.5 years for an article to appear in a peer-reviewed journal about it. I think the importance of the nonpartisan approach has been huge. For those of you who are thinking about trying to do something like this in another country, I think having a nonpartisan type approach is extremely valuable. Now, in some cases, it may not be. I don't know if you want to call Vox Ukraine nonpartisan, or clearly they have a position on sort of economic reform, but you know, if you want to, I think it's been enormously valuable for us. There is a huge bias in the United States on thinking that academics are liberal because academics are overwhelmingly liberal. So I think the fact that we worked really hard on establishing this as nonpartisan was valuable for building our audience. However, what I've discovered is that it's easy to be nonpartisan when you're writing about politics in our country, in your own country, right? So if anyone who's writing in about politics, about something about Trump, we say, don't criticize one party, don't criticize the other party, just talk about the research. It's way more complicated to figure out what does it mean to be nonpartisan in discussing the annexation of Crimea. Right? We can be nonpartisan about not criticizing Democrats or Republicans in the United States about how they explained it, but how do you present international events in a nonpartisan context? And that's been challenging. And I've worked with people, and sometimes I think we've been better at it than others. But you know, people want to write about these things. And you know, what does it mean? You know, does nonpartisan in a U.S. context mean that you shouldn't be saying normative statements about the annexation of Crimea, right? You know, and we've tried really hard to sort of continue on in that thing where, again, it's always the focus is on the research, the focus is on the analysis. The topics may be chosen with particular interest, but we've tried to do it. But it's challenging. The fourth thing I've really learned from this is that is really this importance of research-informed analysis. Like this is a style of research in an increasingly partisan, shrill, fake news, whatever you want to call it, media environment where you can go on and read lots of people writing lots of things that what we as scholars have to offer really is the scientific method. And I think if we can talk about our research in a way where we are emphasizing, right, that what you're reading here is not me trying to tell you my opinion because I'm so frickin' smart and if you would just listen to me everything would be finished, everything would be fixed. It is, there was research that was done, this is what the research learned. You can figure out from there where to take it from there. So I think that's really valuable. And again, it made us different from what a lot of other places are doing. The final thing is, again, what I said before, there's a huge demand for this type of writing. If you want to do this and you're willing to invest a little bit of time in developing some ways to write about academic writing that is less technical and more aimed at an audience, you can find people who want to read it. This is an interesting time politically in the world. Right? There are a lot of smart people who are busy doing a lot of things that want to know stuff about politics. And they're not going to have a lot of time, but they might subscribe to The Economist, they might, you know, read particular newspapers. There's interest in the type of expertise that we can provide. And if you can find ways to take all this hard work you've done in your research and with a little bit of effort, make it more accessible to the wider public, people will want to read it. And I think that will be, ultimately, as academics, that should be satisfying to us. And I think it's important too. So, how do you read The Monkey Cage? If you're new and you didn't know The Monkey Cage and you came here today, you can go to the Washington Post. It's hard to find there, surprisingly hard to find. But if you click on blogs and then you click on Monkey Cage and then you bookmark it, you can get back to it every day. We post usually 4 articles in pretty rapid succession that will appear late morning European time into early afternoon. We post them at like 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 8 a.m., 9 a.m. in the United States. But every day during the week, there's usually at least 4 new pieces that are posted up there. The other thing you can do, which is totally cool, is you can subscribe. So you can subscribe to an email. You just go onto the page. On the actual page, there's a place like it's right around. It's, I don't know, maybe not on this slide, but it's around here someplace where it says subscribe to the newsletter. If you subscribe to the newsletter, then you get an email every day that has the posts that are on it. You can follow us on Twitter. You can also follow us on Twitter, or you can follow us on Facebook. My understanding is that the post paywall should not kick in if you have the links from Twitter or Facebook. The other thing with the Washington Post is that if you have a .edu email address, which I realize a lot of you probably don't have, but if you were at a US university or you're spending time at a US university and you sign up with a .edu address, you can get unlimited access to the Washington Post, and you can keep that login once you've verified it the first time. We were under the assumption that if you clicked in from our Twitter links and from our Facebook posts, it would not count against the Post paywall. Now, I've heard something recently that maybe that's not the case, but if it's not, it should be. And we do tweet. It does. Our Twitter feed is both humans tweeting on it, but it's also a bot, and so it will tweet every new article. So if you can't, for whatever reason, it's problematic to get to the page. If you check Twitter, the Monkey Cage blog Twitter account once a day, or the Facebook post, you'll get our recent posts. So anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Professor Tucker, for this great and inspiring presentation. So we have a couple of minutes for questions.
It would be the third thing I believe that I'm saying for the lectures. So you mentioned that it was really hard to keep the nonpartisan approach. Are there any specific instruments, approaches that you've used in your team? Or maybe there are some resources where you can get certain advice on this?
That's a great question. We really, it would be interesting now that we are all out there giving all these talks. We probably should write something up and just post it, like a 20-page, kind of like our experiences and guides with this. So the funny thing about the Monkey Cage is, like, to call us a team is somewhat pushing it. Like, we've never all been in the same room at the same time. This was really loosely organized for like the first 7 or 8 years. Since we moved to the Post, we've started having slightly more organization, but really it's like we meet at the American Political Science Association, whoever happens to be there. We had our first like meeting ever like recently. So it's fairly loosely. So I'm not going to tell you what the team does in this. I can only tell you what I do. So what I have done is I have tried to, in order to do this, I kind of do look for this in pieces. The first is, sometimes you just start off reading the piece and it just feels like an op-ed, right? Like if the first sentence is, Putin showed his dictatorial impulses yet once again by doing this humane, like that's not a research-informed analysis. That's an op-ed. So I try to get away from emotional language, right? Like adjectives that are modifying things in a normative standpoint, really staying away from normative, good versus bad, and instead, what is the effect of X on Y, and let it be up to the reader whether more of Y is a good thing or a bad thing. So I think that's one thing you can do. The other thing is, I think that in staying away from the should and this would be better if they did this, like all these sort of because you can have opinion pieces that aren't partisan and you can have partisan pieces that aren't opinion. But I think by trying to get rid of both of them, it sort of helps with the other one. So if you stay away from the shoulds and this would be better if they did this, that helps with this as well, like in writing about things. The other thing too I've noticed is that often pieces people are trying to pay attention to this, and they write a piece that's basically about research-informed analysis, but they just can't help themselves when they get to the last paragraph, the last sentence. So the last sentence is like, and so if these electoral reforms are instituted, it will likely lead to, more da-da-da, more da-da. And then like, this will be a disaster for Ukraine, so should be avoided, right? Like, and then if you just get rid of that last sentence, like that's one of the biggest comments I've had, like, this is basically fine, but you need to change the last sentence to be less normative. I mean, it's just this like desire to, on your way out the door, be like, say something like that. So, but I think it just takes practice. And I think that people are pretty good if you tell them ahead of time, don't write an op-ed and don't write it from a partisan, just focus on what we know from the research. Like, you want to write about the history of, I think like we had this piece in Crimea that talked about sort of the history of Eastern Orthodox in Crimea that was written by someone who'd been studying this for years. That was not something that was getting mainstream news coverage. Mainstream news coverage in the West was about, this was Russia versus the United States fighting again, and so, but with that kind of a piece, it's like, it's very easy to slip from, because Russia has this long-standing historic, because there are these religious connotations to things in Crimea that justify. No, don't go there. Like, you're informing the public, you've done this research, it's really interesting. Don't say whether it justifies the annexation of Crimea or not. Just put the information out there and then you can go on from there. So I think that those kinds of things, like getting it in your head when you start to write, is really helpful. But even when you start to do that, having someone read it over, like me, who's been doing this for a long time, can do that. But those, it's definitely more an art than a science. And I think we do it differently across different editors too. I'm not even sure we're consistent in how I've been, because it's so hard to figure this out in an international context. I've tried to be particularly hardcore about like getting rid of the word good and getting rid of the word bad or better or worse, and really focusing in on, what is the argument you're making and what's the evidence in support of that argument.
So it's like journal aesthetics, basically, as well as the not trying to force the context onto the reader of the piece, and, well, the general sense of balance within the article, not trying to put the, once again, the context.
Well, okay, so that's where it gets really, complicated. So I don't think you need to, there's a lot of actually discussion about this in the United States right now about false equivalence, right? That you say, one candidate did these 17 horrible things, and this other candidate, their emails are still, we're still wondering about their emails, right? Like, because you have to do the either or. That's not what I'm saying. Like, if you want to write, like I'm editing a piece right now about whether there's an argument in China about whether or not if Xi gets a third term, this is actually going to be destabilizing for the Communist Party, or it's going to be not destabilizing for the Communist Party. So you could argue that's kind of has a partisan connotation to it. What we would argue is that what I would sort of do in editing, what we've done in editing this is sort of say, like, look, get the arguments out there, say this is what this argument, this is what this argument, and then, here's what researchers have argued about why it's going to destabilize. I recently wrote a book, and I think that I've done my own research, and my sense is that all three of these arguments are overblown. Here's the reason why for each three of them, it may not be destabilizing, and then you end it at that, right? Like, and that's, I think, very different from then saying, starting a piece that says, Xi's talking about going for a third term, this will be a disaster for China. Here's why. Like those kinds of things. So it doesn't have to be balanced. And I think you can make your argument, but you can make your argument I really push people to just make arguments that are like, if research suggests that when this happens, or, hey, look, this thing just happened in the world, what explains it? Well, here's some research that speaks to it. It doesn't have to say, and look, we only give people 1,000 words. You don't have to say, here's the other research that speaks to it, but to acknowledge there's other sets of arguments, and links to other sets of arguments can be helpful. Yeah, it's not easy.
The more we talk about it, the more we realize how complicated it is. So thank you twice, or I don't know how many times for doing this.
Thank you. Oh, it's my pleasure.
I wanted to thank you once again for the lecture. My question kind of takes off where the previous question has ended. So were there cases when, for example, you had to let a bit of partisanship because you felt like you could legitimize something that you wouldn't agree with, or maybe provide, I don't know, like a blueprint for someone how to do something? For example, like if there's a political scientist doing a research on repressions against protests, then answering the question in which case repressions can be effective ultimately gives a blueprint for someone. So
yeah, that's tough. I mean, these are tough questions, right? Like, I mean, so it's interesting. One of the first things I wrote when I came to the Monkey Cage, and again, we were a little more freewheeling in the beginning. Now it's much more like every piece is this nicely crafted 1,000 words. It's about some research agenda, or it's about or it's an explainer on something. One of the first pieces I wrote actually was I saw someone writing about how research on torture had shown that when people are tortured, they don't actually give factual information. And it really struck with me because I was like, if you're the researcher doing that, and you run the study and you find out that torture works, are you still publishing that, right? Like, and if that's not the case, then we have this file drawer problem. You know, like we have this whole big thing in social science with the file drawer problem where people don't publish negative results. But it's even worse if people don't publish ethically, if people are not publishing things that they might be concerned with for ethical reasons, because then you don't trust the things that are published that go in the other direction. So I've wrestled with this for a long time. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you either kind of believe in open science or you don't believe in open science. And the time to be thinking about this is at the research design stage, right? Like if you're doing a project that you think that the implications of that project are going to be ethically trouble. I mean, now we're getting into a whole other arena here. You know, we have I would say where I fall on this is we don't see ourselves at the Monkey Cage as arbitrators of what should or should not be published, other than what should or should not be publicized, other than we want high quality research to be publicized. So if we see stuff but it's really hard because like we're publishing 5 of these things a day, right? Like we're not doing peer review, we're not sending it out to reviewers or anything like that, and we all have day jobs doing what I was doing in all those other talks, right? Like so, it's really difficult because sometimes I'm like, well, who am I to like tell this person that this research in 5 minutes that I don't like their research project? But we've had to do a little bit more of that as we've gotten more and more submissions because we have to make decisions about what we're going to put our resources in because we now have editorial staff that we pay who help edit these things. So there really is a cost to adding more stuff. So I think that I'll give you an example of this. Like we have published work, we were talking about this before, on the Monkey Cage about forensics of electoral fraud. So we've run stuff on elections that describe new toolkits that have been designed by scholars to spot electoral fraud. Now, on the one hand, that's great, right? Because you would think then that will publicize. So like there are these scholars at the University of Michigan who built this toolkit that anyone can use to analyze electoral fraud. Now, whether the methods are perfect is that was an earlier topic of discussion, but let's just assume for the moment it's information. So you can be sitting here in Ukraine, download this toolkit off their website, run your precinct electoral results through it and see if there's possibility. So on the one hand, you might think, normatively, that's a great thing to be publicizing, that this is out there. You might even think that if regimes begin to believe that everyone can detect electoral fraud, they'll be less likely to engage in electoral fraud. You might believe that if that's the case, they're actually going to do other things like kick candidates off ballots ahead of time. So you might not think that's a good thing, right?
That's actually what Russia did.
Yeah, Mezhdinami, right? Anyway, but right. So you might exactly this, and I wrote about this. I actually wrote exactly about this. Why were they sticking cameras in these polling places in 2011, and what was going to be the downstream effects of these kinds of things? But my point is, in doing that, I think you can overthink these things, right? Because it's also possible that if we publish these electoral fraud detection methods, people will read this, the people who are carrying out the fraud will read about them and will be able to manipulate the data in a way that they aren't detected by electoral fraud. And actually, there's this super interesting piece from Walter Mebane and Kirill Cannon who published this piece on the Monkey Cage, suggesting that that they may have actually been trying to sort of screw with them by having something end up on exactly the right number for this. Anyway, that's a longer story. That's not our responsibility to make the decision, I don't think, that things are likely to have negative or positive reverberations. I think there are things we could do, but if people are doing research on this and they're trying to share the things of the research. Now, it's a good question to say, right, like if you have research on what are tactics that work to suppress protest and you publicize that, but I think that's a much larger question for us to think about as a discipline and what our job is as scientists. And I think that I'm sure you could come up with something that we would say, hey, we're not going to, if you came in and said, hey, I just did this great research on like what forms of torture work best to extract information, we probably would not throw that up on the Monkey Cage. But it's a good question. It's tough. It's tough. Oh, but I want to say one other thing, since this is what the questions have been about, like how to write nonpartisan and non-opinionated stuff. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that at all. That's the story of what we did in this blog. Like actually, 80% of the lots of the online content that people are looking for is exactly that, is commentary, is arguments. And it's a great thing to be doing my research suggests that we really should do this. Like, this is the electoral reform we should implement because I did all this research that shows it reduces corruption. Or if you want to get rid of corruption, my research suggests you want to have simultaneous elections, not sequential elections, and therefore we should adopt it. In the monkey cage, we would stop at my research demonstrates X. We wouldn't say you should have it, but if you were to publish it in an op-ed in the Kiev Post, you're perfectly willing to go ahead and say we should do this. You know, like, so I'm not trying to say you shouldn't do this. I'm just sort of telling our story and why I think this was helpful for starting up our blog. Now, people have tried, I know there's like a Swedish monkey cage blog. I think there's like a Swiss one, and they don't call them the Swedish monkey cage, but like when they launched their blog, they said, we're going to try to, you know, we've seen the monkey cage in the United States. We want to do the same thing for Sweden. So like, if you want to try to do something like what we're doing in Ukraine, those are things that have worked well for us. But it's not in any way, we're getting into this, like, how do you actually do this? You can absolutely write about your research in an advocacy way, and I think that's perfectly fine. It's just not what we try to publish.
Thank you. And the last one.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Do you choose topics in some way? Like, for example, if there is an upcoming presidential elections, is it more likely that posts related to elections will be published?
Yes. So it's one of the biggest things about the move to the Post. We always wanted to write about things that were topical because it was a better, you know, people were interested in it. It was a better way to, you know, get involved in the discussion. We do that more and more exclusively now, where we're much, much more likely to publish pieces if there's a hook to something that's ongoing right now. The other thing, just since people are asking about the monkey cage in particular, and like submissions, is that most of what I talked about here is this sort of research-informed analysis. We do this other style of piece called explainers, which we're doing a lot of now, which are like these, here are 5 things you need to know about X. And this can also be a great way. Now, ideally, this is related to your research that you're doing, but it may just be that there are Ukrainian parliamentary elections coming up, and most people reading the Washington Post don't know anything about the Ukrainian parliament. So writing a piece that says, here are the 5 main things you need to know about the Ukrainian parliamentary elections is really valuable, right? There are other flip ways on that, like, here are 4 things that the mainstream media has wrong about the, you know, French elections or something like that. But we do, especially with elections, and I started this thing years ago when we were independent of doing these election reports because I was really frustrated about what I was saying before, that academics would if you wanted to know what an academic who was an expert in Slovakia thought about an election, that you might get 1 sentence of a quote for them, or they would write that electoral studies election report that would appear in 2 years. So I literally got in touch with electoral studies. We were trying to coordinate with them. I wanted the monkey cage to kind of fill that void. And so I have a lot of these election reports that people have written for me over the years, which is like a scholar who knows that country well, maybe is from the country, maybe has done a lot of field work in the country, who writes, like, before the election a pre-election report, or after the election a post-election report. So not everything has to be like, I did this research and then I learned this. Some of it you can be like, I know a lot about this topic. It's being discussed in the mainstream media now. Here are like 5 main things. So you can think of those as kind of country expert reports in. You can also think of them as sort of like, in a sense, like almost like a sort of very mini literature review. Like, here's what you need, you know, here's what social scientists think about fixing corruption, and, you know, 5 main points or something like that. So we do publish a bunch of pieces like that.
Thank you one more time. Отож, після того, дякую вам дуже за вашу активність, за ваші запитання, за те, що ви прийшли сюди, виділили час. Я закликаю вас після того, як ви підпишетеся на сторінку The Monkey Cage у Фейсбуці чи в Твіттері, також підписатися на сторінку нашої організації Цифра Груп, для того, щоб бути в курсі всіх наступних наших просвітницьких заходів. Також ми дуже дякуємо Американському дому за те, що нас гостинно прийняв, і Американському посольству за те, що допоміг нам зробити цей візит професора Такера реальним. Дуже вам дякуємо і до наступних зустрічей.